Long before history, before the first word was carved into stone, giants walked the earth. They shaped mountains, carved rivers, and watched the birth of humankind. Then they vanished, leaving behind only whispers in myth and traces in stone. But the earth never forgets. Beneath every step we take lies a memory of something vast, something alive, waiting for silence to return. Some say they were gods, others say they were guardians. And perhaps they are not gone at all, merely sleeping beneath the ice, under mountain, dreaming of the world they built. Tonight, we return to that forgotten age, to the moment before memory became myth, when the earth was young and fire was still a miracle. Before we begin this journey, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications, because stories like this, stories buried in the bones of the world, must be remembered. Now, let us go back to the beginning, to when the world was young and the giants still walked among men. 40,000 years ago, before the first city, before the first name was ever spoken, the world was young and untamed. Endless plains of frost stretched beneath a silver sky, where mammoths roamed like slow-moving storms, and the wind itself sang through the bones of the earth. Fire was still a new thing, fragile and miraculous, flickering in the trembling hands of humankind. The nights were long, the stars uncountable, their light sharp enough to cut through the cold. Every mountain seemed alive then, every river a god. Humanity was small. They huddled in caves, wrapped in hides, their breath rising like ghosts into the chill air. They feared the dark but also worshipped it, for in the dark came dreams, and in dreams came the stories that built the soul. Yet, even in those earliest tales whispered by firelight, there were always others. Beings who watched from the edges of the frozen forests, whose footprints left craters in the snow. Their eyes glowed like embers, and their shadows stretched far across the tundra. They were not beasts, not gods, but something older than both. The people called them the Great Ones. Some said they had risen from the mountains when the world was still cooling, shaped from stone and storm. Others believed they had fallen from the stars, travelers from a sky that never ends. Whatever their origin, their presence was undeniable. Hunters returning from the plains spoke of voices that echoed through the ice valleys, deep, resonant, mournful. Entire herds would change direction when those sounds rolled across the horizon. No one dared approach them, not then. But sometimes, when the storms broke and the air turned still, the tribes would find strange things left behind in the snow. Stones carved with spirals no human hand could make. Bones etched with symbols that glowed faintly under the moon. The elders said these were messages, signs that the giants did not wish for war, only remembrance. Yet the world was changing. The ice began to move. Seasons grew harsher, prey scarcer, tempers shorter, and in the fragile balance between the small and the mighty, fear began to whisper louder than wonder. The fires of humankind burned brighter, but so did their hunger, their ambition, their will to survive. On those frozen nights, when the sky burned with auroras and the earth creaked beneath its own weight, the giants watched from the ridges above. They had seen many ages rise and fall, but this was something new. The age of men had begun, and with it, the slow fading of the giants. In the deep silence of the Stone Age, before words ruled the world, the first tribes moved like shadows beneath towering cliffs of ice and stone. They spoke not with tongues but with their hands, with the rhythm of fire and the music of bone flutes that echoed softly across the plains. Every gesture carried meaning. A nod meant danger. A lifted palm meant peace. In those days, survival was a language, and silence was sacred. The earth was their teacher, and the stars were their map. They hunted mammoths and reindeer along the frozen rivers, their spears hardened by flame, their courage tested by hunger. Each night, they gathered around small fires, the smoke curling upward like prayers to a sky thick with stars. They believed every flame carried a spirit, every shadow, a story. Their lives were fragile, brief, but their hearts burned with the will to endure. And yet, there was something older that shared their world. Sometimes, when the mist rolled in from the valley, hunters would see movement on the ridges above them, shapes too large, too deliberate, to be beasts. Tall, broad figures standing still as statues, watching. Their silhouettes lingered against the dawn, and when the light came, they were gone, leaving only the deep marks of footprints pressed into stone. The tribes whispered of the tall ones, beings of strength and stillness, whose eyes reflected the firelight like pools of amber. They were neither beast nor god, but something caught in between. At first, the tribes believed the tall ones were spirits, guardians of the wild. They left offerings for them at the edge of the forest bones, fruit, carved stones painted red with clay. But there were nights when strange sounds drifted through the dark, deep voices that hummed like thunder beneath the earth. The fires trembled, and the children woke crying, their dreams full of giants who walked without sound. Still, curiosity grew stronger than fear. One day, a hunter named Sarah followed the trail of great footprints up the frozen ridge. What she found there would haunt the tribe forever. A handprint, enormous and clear, pressed into the rock itself. It was warm to the touch, proof that the tall ones were real, and closer than anyone dared believe. Long before the first human carved a symbol into stone, the mountains had already written their own story. It was said that deep within the heart of the world, when fire met ice and the sky first learned to rumble, the children of stone were born. They emerged from caverns older than memory, their skin pale as mountain ash, their eyes glimmering like fire reflected in water. They breathed the cold air as though it belonged to them, and wherever they walked, the earth seemed to bow in quiet recognition. They lived where no human dared to climb, in citadels carved into sheer cliffs that pierced the clouds. Great pillars of rock bore their marks, spirals, suns and stars etched into the walls like a secret language. Their tools, forged from black stone and the bones of creatures long extinct, were larger than any man could lift. Hunters who stumbled upon these relics would kneel in awe, tracing the grooves left by hands the size of shields. The giants, it seemed, were not mindless brutes but builders, shaping a world beyond the reach of humankind. To the tribes below, the children of stone were both salvation and terror. Some said they kept the balance of nature, guiding storms, protecting rivers, and ensuring that the herds returned each spring. Others whispered that they took what they wanted when the moon was full fire from the camps, animals from the pens, and sometimes, though none dared to speak it aloud, a child. Mothers told stories by the fire to keep their little ones close. "Obey the night," they said, "or the children of stone will hear your breath." Yet there were moments of wonder too. Travelers told of watching one kneel beside a frozen lake, cupping water in its enormous hands and releasing it into the air like prayer. They were creatures of silence, not cruelty. And in that silence, mankind felt both gratitude and fear. The tribes began to paint them on cave walls, towering figures with glowing eyes standing beside the moon. Each line of ochre and ash was a confession. They did not just live among gods and beasts. They lived beneath something greater. Something that remembered the world before men were born. The winter came like a slow death, swallowing the world in silence. Snow fell for moons without pause, smothering the plains, sealing rivers beneath glass. The herds vanished, the trees grew brittle, and the fires of humankind began to die. Families huddled in caves, their breath freezing in the air, their songs replaced by the sound of hunger. The world itself seemed to mourn, and even the sky refused to give light. It was in that endless night that the giants came down from the mountains. They appeared through the snow like living monoliths, their forms half hidden by storm and shadow. The tribes watched in fear as they approached, carrying strange objects that glowed faintly through the white haze. The giants spoke no words, but their gestures were clear. They came not as conquerors, but as givers of life. One of them knelt before a dying fire, placed a hollow stone upon it, and with a single breath, brought the flames roaring back to life. Inside that stone burned a fire that never went out, fed not by wood but by something older. The giants taught the tribes how to shape bone into blades so sharp they could cut through hide and ice alike. They showed them how to trap heat within stone, how to read the wind, how to survive when the world itself turned against them. For the first time, humans stood beside their towering kin, not beneath them. They hunted together, shared food, and built fires that glowed like suns in the darkness. Children no longer cried through the night. For a brief moment, the cold loosened its grip, but with the warmth came unease. The tribes began to fear what they could not understand. The giants never slept. Their eyes glowed through the night like embers, always watching. Some believed the gifts were not kindness but control, that mankind had traded its freedom for survival. Whispers grew like cracks in ice, spreading from fire to fire. Still, for a generation, there was peace. The fires burned strong, and the giants walked among the tribes as silent guardians. Yet deep in their glowing eyes there lingered sorrow, as if they knew the warmth they had given would one day ignite something far more dangerous than winter. The snow had begun to thin, but hunger still ruled the land. The rivers were cracked with ice, the forests bare, and the winds carried nothing but the scent of cold stone. Humans and giants, once divided by fear, now moved as one. They hunted side by side, following herds that wandered between valleys. The giants brought strength, tearing open frozen rivers and lifting the carcasses that men could not move. The tribes brought cunning, traps, and fire. Together they survived when the earth itself seemed unwilling to let them live. In those days, a bond was formed, sealed not by words but by blood. The elders said that during the first great hunt, a giant had shared its kill with humankind, and in return, the hunters had cut their palms and pressed them to the giant's massive hand. Blood met blood, and from that moment, peace held. Children were born who knew the sight of towering figures as protectors, not monsters. Fires were built in shared circles, and for the first time, laughter echoed across the frozen plains. But balance is a fragile thing. One night, under a pale red moon, a hunting party from the southern tribe strayed too far. They found a young giant alone near the riverbank, its body draped in fur, its eyes curious and unafraid. The humans, gaunt with starvation, mistook innocence for threat. Fear twisted into violence. When the first spear flew, it was not hunger that guided it, but the memory of powerlessness. The giant child fell where the ice met the water, its blood spreading like a dark flower beneath the moonlight. By morning, the snow trembled with footsteps. The giants came in silence, their faces carved with grief. They lifted the child's body and carried it toward the mountains without a sound. The tribes waited for mercy, but none came. That night, the sky burned red with unseen fire. Mountains groaned, rivers boiled, and the warmth that had once united them turned to ash. The blood pact was broken. The giants withdrew into the mist, and humankind was left to face the cold alone. The age of peace was over, and something far darker had begun to stir beneath the snow. The first tremor came at dawn. It began as a low groan, deep beneath the frozen ground, rolling through the valleys like the growl of something ancient waking from sleep. Birds scattered in clouds of black, and the air itself seemed to pulse. Then the mountains split open. From their slopes came the giants, their silhouettes blotting out the rising Sunday. The peace that had held through a generation shattered in a single breath. Their wrath was not loud at first. It was deliberate, unstoppable, like the slow breaking of the world itself. Forests burned beneath their hands. Trees that had stood for centuries toppled in waves of flame. Rivers boiled where their feet struck. The wind filled with the cries of the fleeing, the sound of bone and stone colliding, of homes crushed beneath the weight of vengeance. The giants did not roar, they did not curse. Their silence was worse than fury. It was grief, hardened into destruction. They moved through the valleys like storms, their eyes glowing red with reflected fire, and wherever they passed, nothing living remained. The tribes scattered in every direction, abandoning the hunting grounds that had once sustained them. Entire clans vanished into the plains, hiding in caves and forests, learning for the first time what it meant to survive through cunning rather than strength. They began to dig traps, to disguise their fires, to move only by night. The giants had forced them into evolution. Fear became their teacher, strategy their only weapon. For the first time, humans began to fight not with muscle but with mind. In one valley, a small group of survivors built a wall of mammoth bones, the first barrier ever raised by human hands. They watched the horizon burn, waiting for the shapes of the giants to emerge through the smoke. When they came, the humans did not run. They hid. They waited. And when the first giant stepped across the boundary, the ice beneath its feet shattered, collapsing into a pit of sharpened stakes. The creature fell, roaring for the first time, and the earth trembled with its death. That night, the tribes realized something they had never dared to believe. The giants could bleed, and blood could change everything. Among the scattered survivors who fled the burning valleys, one woman walked apart from the rest. Her name was Asa, a hunter's daughter born beneath the red moon. She carried no weapon, no fire, only the strange gift of seeing what others could not. From childhood, her dreams had crossed into places untouched by men. In her sleep, she wandered through mountains that breathed and rivers that whispered. She saw the giants not as monsters, but as something older, bound to the earth in ways humankind would never understand. The others feared her. They said she spoke to shadows, that her eyes glimmered in the firelight like those of the giants themselves. But when the wrath of the mountains ended and the world fell silent again, it was Asa who led the survivors through the ash. She walked where the ground was still warm, tracing the deep footprints left behind, her hand brushing over the scorched stones, as if reading a language written by the gods. At night, she would sit by the dying fires and close her eyes, her body still, her breath shallow. In those moments, her mind crossed the threshold between worlds. In her visions, she saw the giants mourning beside the ruins of their own kind. They were not invincible, not eternal. Beneath their strength, they feared something even they could not defeat. Asa saw time itself consuming them. The mountains that birthed them were eroding, the rivers carving through their stone halls. The cold that once sustained them was fading. They were dying, not by war, but by the turning of the earth. Their power was ancient, but their age was ending. When Asa awoke, she spoke of what she had seen. The people listened in silence as she told them that the giants' wrath was not hate but despair. They fought because they knew they were fading. Their rage was the cry of a dying race. The tribe did not understand her words, but they felt their weight. Asa stood beneath the stars that night, her breath rising like smoke, and whispered to the wind, promising that she would remember both races. For in her dreams, she had seen the truth that would one day bind them. The giants feared not man, but time, and time belonged to both. The war began beneath a crimson sky. Smoke curled above the mountains where the giants had once lived, drifting across the plains like the breath of dying gods. The humans no longer ran. They had learned to hide, to strike from the dark, to use the world itself as a weapon. What began as survival grew into defiance. Fire became their language of vengeance. Spears tipped with stone-pierced flesh that once seemed unbreakable, and though the giants towered over them like living fortresses, the balance had begun to shift. For centuries the war raged. Seasons lost meaning. Entire generations were born into battle and died without knowing peace. The rivers ran red each spring, carrying the blood of both species into the sea. Forests that had once whispered with life now stood silent, their trunks blackened by flame. Even the wind seemed to mourn. The giants, once noble and untouchable, fought with desperation. They hurled boulders across valleys, crushed villages beneath their feet, and roared to a sky that no longer answered. Yet with every victory, they grew fewer. Something unseen stalked them. Hunger hollowed their strength. The great herds they once hunted had vanished. Sickness spread through their kind like frost through a dying forest. Their wounds no longer healed as they once did. The air itself felt thinner, the cold less kind. The world that had birthed them was changing, and it no longer belonged to their kind. They were creatures of the old earth, bound to an age that was slipping away. The humans, hardened by suffering, adapted. They built traps that used gravity and ice, pits disguised by snow, weapons designed to wound instead of kill. They learned patience. They learned cruelty. What they could not overcome with force, they achieved with cunning. And still, the giants fought on, unable to yield, unwilling to fade. In the last years of the war, the horizon burned every night. The giants stood upon the ridges watching the fires below, their silhouettes etched against the glow. They did not roar or curse. They only watched, silent and still, as if accepting what they had always known. The age of giants was ending, and humanity was learning what it meant to inherit a dying world. It began with a mistake. A young hunter named Kale left his spear too close to the fire one night. When he drew it from the coals, the wood was darkened, hardened, its tip sharp as obsidian. He thrust it against a mammoth bone out of curiosity, and the bone cracked clean in two. The fire had changed the wood, given it strength beyond nature. Kale did not yet understand what he had created, but fate did. Within days, the secret spread from one tribe to another, whispered in awe. The flames that once warmed their hands had become the forge of revolution. The hunters began to experiment. They dipped spearheads into the embers until they glowed and cooled them in snow, repeating the ritual until the wood was almost as hard as stone. When the first strike drew blood from a charging aurochs, they realized what that meant. If fire could pierce the beasts of the plains, it could pierce the flesh of the giants. The thought came quietly at first, a dangerous seed planted in desperation, but hunger and vengeance made it bloom. The next hunt was not for food, it was for proof. Kale and his hunters waited beneath the ridge where a lone giant gathered water from the river. Its reflection shimmered in the current like a god's shadow. The humans crept forward, their spears glowing faintly with the memory of flame. When they struck, the sound was not of wood meeting stone, but of something ancient breaking. The spear sank deep into the giant's leg. For the first time they heard it cry out. The sound shook the valley, a roar of shock and betrayal. The hunters fled, but their triumph spread faster than fire itself. Every tribe learned the secret, and with it came power. Spears of flame-hardened wood filled the plains. The giants bled, and when blood met earth, the rivers ran dark. The balance that had once defined the world was shattered. But victory carried a price. The fire that gave strength also consumed. Forests burned, smoke blotted out the stars, and the warmth that once united man and giant now devoured them both. The hunters had become the hunted, and fire had chosen its new master. The north had always been the realm of silence, a place where ice ruled like a king, and the wind spoke in voices older than man. It was there that the last of the giants gathered, retreating from the wars that had consumed their kind. Their numbers had fallen to a handful. Their great forms hunched beneath the weight of extinction. They no longer roared across the mountains or hunted beneath the stars. They only watched, listening to the earth that had once obeyed them grow cold and strange. The humans had taken the plains. The forests had turned to ash. The world that had birthed them was dying, and in that dying, something inside the giants broke. When the first thaw came, the rivers turned black. The giants, driven by grief and fury, marched to the heart of the frozen mountains. There, beneath the glaciers, lay the old wounds of the world, cracks where fire still burned beneath the crust of ice. The giants began to dig, their hands tearing through rock and frost, their voices rising like thunder. The tribes who lived in the valleys saw the sky change color. They heard the ground moan and felt heat bleeding through the snow. Then the earth opened. Flames erupted from the mountains, spilling molten rivers that carved through the ice. The sky turned red and stayed that way. Forests vanished in moments. Herds fled into the sea. The air filled with ash that blotted out the sun for generations. Humanity watched from the edges of the world as the giants disappeared into the inferno they had unleashed. Some said they were swallowed by the fire, returning to the molten heart that had created them. Others believed they had walked north beyond the ice, into a realm untouched by death. When the fires finally dimmed, the land was unrecognizable. The ice had retreated, leaving behind plains of steam and rivers of stone. The few surviving humans crawled from their caves to see a dawn that no longer felt like their own. The giants were gone, leaving only their footprints, now filled with cooling lava. The age of ice had ended, and in its place began the slow, trembling birth of a new world. The wind howled across the tundra like a voice mourning its own echo. Asa's tribe had been wandering for weeks, following the frozen river north, seeking what the elders called the end of the world. The land was quiet there, stripped bare by centuries of fire and frost. Nothing moved except the drifting snow. Then, one evening, as the pale sun sank behind the horizon, they saw something lying beside a frozen lake. At first, they thought it was a mountain that had fallen, but as they drew closer, they saw the truth. It was a giant, the last of his kind. His body was broken, his breath shallow, steaming faintly in the cold. His skin was gray and cracked, his hair tangled with frost and ash. One of his arms was buried beneath the ice, the other stretched toward the sky as if still reaching for something that no longer existed. The tribe approached cautiously, weapons raised, though none truly believed they could harm him. Asa stepped forward first. She felt no fear, only sorrow. His eyes followed her, vast and dim like dying stars. When he spoke, it was not with sound, but with a resonance that trembled through the bones of every living thing around him. He told them of a world that once belonged to both their kinds. A world of balance, where fire warmed without destroying, where strength did not mean conquest. He spoke of the first winter, the first pact, and the betrayal that had shattered everything. His words were heavy, but his tone held no anger, only regret. The humans had taken the earth, but they had inherited its burden too. He warned them that power was a flame that always demanded to be fed, and one day, they would feed it everything they loved. Asa knelt beside him, her hand resting against his arm, feeling the slow rhythm of a heart the size of a mountain fading beneath her palm. The giant's eyes closed, the wind stilled. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then the ice beneath them cracked, and the giant slipped beneath the surface, claimed by the lake's frozen depths. Asa whispered a promise into the silence. He would not be forgotten. For 3 days, Asa's tribe remained beside the frozen lake where the giant had fallen. The air was still, the silence so deep that even the crack of ice seemed like a prayer. They could not leave him exposed to the cold, not after his final words had settled in their hearts like embers that refused to fade. Asa stood before the tribe, her breath curling through the air, and declared that he would not be forgotten. The others watched her in silence, knowing she spoke with the weight of something greater than herself. Together, they began to build. They gathered stones from the riverbanks, slabs of ice, and boulders carried from the valley by their ancestors. They worked without words, each movement deliberate, as if guided by unseen hands. The ground shook beneath their effort. Yet none stopped. When the last stone was raised, it stood taller than any man. They laid the giant beneath it, his body wrapped in furs and ash, his face turned toward the stars that had once watched his kind walk the earth. Asa pressed her palm to his chest one final time before it was covered. The cold had claimed him, but in that moment it felt as though the world itself bowed in mourning. When the tomb was finished, they marked it with symbols carved into the stone, spirals that represented the turning of the seasons, lines that followed the path of the Sunday, circles that mirrored the stars reflected in the lake. It was more than a burial. It was a promise to remember. When night fell, Asa lit fires around the tomb, their flames flickering against the carvings, making them shimmer like constellations. The tribe stood together in the orange glow, feeling the pull of something eternal. Asa spoke softly to the fire, her words carried by the wind. She said that strength and wisdom were not measured in size, but in memory, and that the world would never again be shared by giants and men, yet both would live on in story. The firelight caught her eyes, and for a brief moment she seemed to glow like the dawn. When morning came, frost covered the stones, sealing the tomb forever. It was the first monument of humankind, and the earth remembered. Generations passed, and the lake where Asa's tribe buried the last giant froze so deeply that even the memory of water seemed to vanish. The wind carried new songs, and the children of humankind grew in number, spreading across the plains, through forests, and over mountains the giants once called home. The earth softened beneath their feet, the air warmed, and the great beasts of the old world began to fade. The fires still burned at night, but around them, the stories had changed. The elders spoke of the giants only in whispers, their voices low so the wind would not carry the words too far. To the young, they were no longer gods or neighbors but creatures of warning. If you stray too far from the fire, the tall ones will find you. If you disobey, they will take you to the mountains and never return you. The children listened wide-eyed, the flicker of the flames painting shadows on the cave walls that seemed to stretch and move like something alive. In those moments, fear became a teacher, shaping memory into myth. But among the storytellers, there were a few who spoke differently. Around dying embers, when the night was deepest, they told that the giants had not vanished at all. They said that beneath the glaciers, beneath the ancient rivers of ice, the giants slept in the dark. Their hearts still beat, slow as stone. Their eyes still dreamed of a world covered in frost. They were waiting, patient as the mountains, for the cold to return and wake them. The tribes built shrines of stone to keep the memory alive. Circles of rock aligned with the stars, as if to mark where the sleepers lay. In winter, the wind that passed through them made strange low tones, like the breathing of something vast beneath the earth. Some claimed to see movement within the ice, faint shapes shifting under the moonlight. The world had entered a quieter time. The roars of giants were gone, replaced by whispers of mankind. Yet deep in the silence, the earth still remembered. The giants were not gone. They were merely waiting, dreaming beneath the frozen ground, as time slowly forgot their names. The boy's name was Iran, a young hunter born long after the last storyteller had whispered the old tales. His tribe lived where the ice met the sea, in a land of endless wind and light that never softened. The stories of giants had become nothing more than echoes told to children who no longer believed, but Aaron was restless. He felt the pull of the mountains, the strange hum that carried through the frozen air whenever the sun struck the cliffs. One morning, chasing a wounded stag across the glacier, he followed a trail of blood into a narrow cleft between two sheets of blue ice. Inside, the air was warmer than he expected. His torch sputtered and hissed, the flame painting the walls in gold. The tunnel wound downward like the throat of the earth, opening into a vast chamber where the ice gleamed as if filled with trapped light. Aaron lifted his torch higher and froze. The walls were covered in carvings, figures of men and giants standing together, their hands pressed palm to palm. Between them burned the shape of a flame. Around it spiraled stars, rivers, and the sunday. The art was ancient, older than any tribe, etched by hands that had long turned to dust. He moved closer, tracing the grooves with his fingers. The scale of it was overwhelming. The giants were carved not as monsters, but as kin. Their faces were solemn, their gestures gentle. The humans beside them stood tall, not in fear, but in reverence. It was proof that the two had once lived as one, bound by something deeper than survival. Aaron felt a tremor beneath his feet, faint but real, like a heartbeat echoing through the stone. He knew he should leave, yet he could not look away. At the far end of the chamber, a great handprint was pressed into the ice, each finger longer than his arm. Inside the frozen palm, a faint red glow pulsed softly, like a sleeping ember. He reached toward it, the light reflecting in his eyes, and for a single breath the cave seemed alive, whispering in a tongue older than sound. When Aaron emerged into the sunlight, The wind had changed. The mountain was awake. Aaron's hand trembled as he reached toward the glowing handprint frozen within the wall. The ice was impossibly smooth, warm beneath his fingertips. Then the edge of his spear scraped across the stone, slicing the skin of his palm. Blood welled up and fell, one crimson drop sinking into the carved spiral below. The chamber seemed to draw breath. The flame of his torch flickered, then steadied, and a deep hum rose through the ground. The walls began to glow, faint at first, then brighter, veins of light spreading through the carvings like the slow pulse of something waking from a dream. Aaron stumbled back, clutching his bleeding hand. The carvings around him shimmered to life. The figures of men and giants that once stood frozen in silence now seemed to move, their arms reaching toward each other, their faces alive with expression. Between them the etched flame blazed gold, casting reflections across the ice until the whole cave appeared to burn without heat. The light reached the ceiling, revealing more symbols spiraling upward: moons, waves, stars, all connected by lines that pulsed like living roots. The hum grew deeper, vibrating in his bones. He heard whispers inside his mind, not in words but in memory, 1,000 voices blending into one. He saw flashes of the world before, green valleys beneath a silver sky, humans and giants walking side by side, building monuments of stone together. He saw the first fire shared between them, and the promise that bound them. Then came the breaking, the blood, the war, the silence. It was all there, living inside the rock, waiting for someone to remember. Aaron fell to his knees, overwhelmed. The glow dimmed as his blood spread into the carvings, fading from gold to red, from red to a soft pulse like the beat of a distant heart. When he finally stood, the cave had gone silent again. The air was heavy, but no longer cold. The ice seemed to watch him. He pressed his uninjured hand against the wall, feeling a faint warmth beneath the surface, as if something within the stone still breathed. When he returned to his tribe, he spoke of what he had seen. The elders gathered around the fire, listening as the flames reflected in their eyes. They marked his palm with ash, calling it an omen. The blood that woke the stone, they said, proved that mankind was not separate from the giants but born from them. Their strength had become flesh, their memory hidden in human blood. That night, Aaron dreamed of a heartbeat beneath the world, slow and endless, echoing through stone and time. In the dream, the giants stirred beneath the ice, their eyes opening to the rhythm of his pulse. The blood of the old ones had remembered itself, and the earth had begun to listen again. The world began to change with a sound no one could hear. It started in the deep places of the earth where fire met stone, and the cold that had gripped the land for thousands of years began to loosen its hold. The glaciers that had shaped the mountains began to weep. Rivers burst from their prisons of ice and tore through the valleys like living things freed from chains. Lakes swelled and spilled over their banks, swallowing the plains where tribes once hunted. The air grew softer, the wind less cruel, and the snow that had once defined the world began to vanish. Aaron's tribe watched from the high ridges as the land they had known disappeared beneath the rising waters. What had been a sea of white turned to an ocean of blue and gray. The ice cracked like thunder in the distance, splitting apart and collapsing into the depths with a sound that rolled through the sky. Each day, new rivers were born, cutting through the stone as if carving a new memory for the earth. The hunters no longer followed herds, they followed the retreating ice, as though chasing ghosts. The warmth brought life and death in equal measure. Grass sprouted where there had once been only frost, but the great beasts of the old world fell. Mammoths sank into the mud where they once roamed, their tusks reaching toward the sky like pleading hands. Tribes moved south, building new fires on lands that had never known footprints. Yet with every mile, they carried stories of what was lost. The giants, the ice, the silence that had defined the age before man's dominion. Asa's tombs and Aaron's carvings were claimed by the flood. The cave where the stone had glowed sank beneath a roaring river, sealed forever beneath layers of silt. The last bones of the giants dissolved in salt water, scattered beneath the new oceans that spread across the world. The mountains that had once been their fortress now stood as islands, and the wind that swept across them carried no voices, only the sigh of melting snow. Those who survived built their camps on higher ground, but something within them felt hollow. The elders said the world was shedding its skin, leaving behind the cold to birth a gentler age. Yet as the fires burned, some claimed to see faces in the water, tall shadows beneath the surface, watching, waiting. The great melting did not just change the land, it erased the last proof of what had come before. History drowned quietly, with no witnesses but the sky and sea. The giants were gone, their story buried in the depths, and humankind inherited a world cleansed by fire and flood, not knowing what it had forgotten. When the waters receded and the earth settled into its new shape, humankind began again. The great beasts were gone. The ice had retreated to the edges of the world, and the air no longer stung the lungs. In the warmth that followed, people built fires not for survival but for gathering. They built shelters from wood and clay, planted seeds in the soil, and watched the green return to the valleys where once there had been only snow. The world had grown smaller, quieter, and for the first time, it belonged entirely to them. They called it the Age of Small Things. No longer did the ground shake with the footsteps of giants or echo with the calls of mammoths. The thunder of creation had faded into the soft murmur of rivers and the laughter of children. Humanity filled the silence left behind, turning survival into song and memory into myth. Villages rose near the water's edge, and every evening the people gathered by the fire to tell stories of the time before warmth. They spoke of beings taller than trees, of hands that could move mountains, of eyes that glowed like stars. Most listened in wonder, but some in unease, for the stories felt less like legend and more like something that still lingered, just out of sight. At night, when the wind was calm and the moon was bright, dreams came differently. Men and women would wake breathless, certain they had heard a voice calling from far away. In their dreams they saw vast figures walking across moonlit plains, silent and watchful. Their outlines were made of mist, their shadows too large to be cast by anything human. Some called them guardians, watching over the fragile world they had left behind. Others whispered that they were ghosts, unable to rest while their memory was fading from human lips. Children played among the stones of the old shrines, not knowing that those circles had once been places of worship where ancestors spoke to the sky. They stacked rocks into towers without realizing they were rebuilding what their forebears had once called holy. And when the wind moved through the cracks between those stones, it carried a sound like breathing, slow and deep, as though the earth itself still remembered. The giants were gone, but their absence shaped everything. Humanity built its future on their bones, its myths on their silence. The world had become small, but within that smallness lived wonder, fear, and the unspoken knowledge that something immense still stirred beneath the soil, dreaming of a time when the earth was young. The new world was full of warmth and noise, yet beneath its gentle surface, something ancient continued to stir. Generations after the great melting, the tribes had spread across the plains and forests, building homes of stone and wood, carving the earth to their will. The giants had become stories told by firelight, tales of awe and warning, reminders that the world had once belonged to beings larger than dreams. But then the children began to change. It started quietly. A boy born in a coastal village grew faster than his brothers, his shoulders broad as a doorframe by his 12th year. A girl in the mountains could lift a boulder that 10 men could not move. Some had eyes that glowed faintly under the moonlight, or skin so pale it caught the sun like polished stone. The elders watched in silence, remembering whispers from the past. They did not call these children cursed or blessed, they called them echoes. Around the fires, the old ones spoke of the blood of the giants, how it had not vanished but slept within humankind, waiting for the right moment to rise again. They said that every generation carried a drop of that memory, hidden deep within the bones. Sometimes, when the world tilted toward change, it awoke. The children with the strength of 10, the voices that carried like thunder, the dreams filled with mountains and stars, these were the reminders that mankind was not as small as it believed. Aaron's bloodline was said to have carried the first spark. His descendants dreamed of caverns filled with light, of hands reaching from stone, of a voice that spoke in the rhythm of the earth. The tribes watched these children carefully, fearful of what they might become. Some believed they were destined to lead humanity into a new age. Others feared they would bring back the power that had once broken the world. When storms came, it was often these children who stood unafraid beneath the lightning, as though hearing something calling to them from the sky. When mountains trembled, they could feel the heartbeat of the earth beneath their feet. And when they closed their eyes at night, they saw figures of impossible size walking through their dreams, watching them with eyes that held both sorrow and pride. The elders said the giants had given their strength to humankind not by choice but by consequence, their essence seeping into the blood of those who survived them. The world had forgotten their names, but their memory endured in flesh and bone. The giants were gone, yet through the children of men, the earth continued to remember. The world had long since forgotten the sound of giant footsteps, yet the memory of their passing lingered in the bones of the earth. The people who came after felt it without understanding. They tilled the soil, fished the rivers, raised their children beneath gentler skies, but something in them yearned for the greatness that had once filled the world. In their dreams, they still saw towering figures made of light and shadow, and when they awoke, they found themselves gathering stones. It began with a single circle, built not for shelter but for remembrance. No one knew why they built it, only that they must. The first stones were raised on the high plains where the wind never stopped moving. Men and women strained together, pulling blocks that outweighed their own bodies 1,000 times. They chanted as they worked, the rhythm echoing the old heartbeats of the world. When the last stone stood upright, the ground trembled slightly, as though approving. They left offerings at its base, bones, feathers, and seeds, small gifts to something vast they could no longer name. As the generations passed, new monuments rose. Circles became corridors, corridors became temples. The people carved symbols into the stones, spirals and suns, lines that reached toward the stars. They said the markings guided the spirits of the old ones, showing them the paths through heaven. Each monolith faced the horizon in silence, watching the seasons turn. When dawn broke, the light touched the stones in perfect sequence, as if the builders had remembered a pattern too ancient to be learned. Across continents, others did the same. In the far west, pillars of granite stood like frozen sentinels over fields of mist. In the east, vast sanctuaries were carved into the earth, where priests whispered to the dark, calling it the voice of the forgotten. Everywhere, humans shaped stone into memory, not knowing they were repeating the gestures of the giants. The earth itself became their cathedral, its pillars the ribs of a world that refused to forget its makers. At night, the elders told the children that the stones were alive. They said that when the wind blew through them, it carried the murmurs of the old ones still dreaming beneath the ground. Some believed the monuments were doorways, thresholds between the past and the living world. Others thought they were warnings, reminders of power that once walked the earth and would one day return. When the moon rose above the ancient circles, shadows stretched across the fields, like the long fingers of something unseen. The stones did not move, yet their silence was heavy, almost human. They stood for all that had been lost, monuments to memory itself, and in their quiet endurance, the giants lived on, carved not from flesh, but from the eternal memory of stone. Night fell slowly over the ancient world, and with it came a silence that felt older than time itself. The fires of humankind flickered across the plains, small points of light scattered beneath a sky so vast it seemed to swallow everything. The people had built their villages, their monuments, their songs, but somewhere beneath their triumphs lay the hum of something deeper, something eternal. The earth was not still. It was breathing. Beneath the mountains, under layers of stone and ice, the old bones of the world rested. Rivers carved through ancient tombs, carrying whispers through caverns where the air was thick with the scent of minerals and age. If one listened closely, Beyond the rush of water and the grinding of rock, there was another sound, a rhythm slow and steady, the pulse of a heart that had never truly stopped. The Titans, the first giants, were not gone. They slept in the dark, their dreams shaping the very veins of the planet. The stars above burned brighter than ever, as though keeping vigil. They had watched it all unfold, the wars, the floods, the rise of mankind. They watched the giants descend from mountain thrones, watched their cities turn to dust, watched humanity inherit the earth with trembling hands. Yet even the stars seemed to know that nothing truly ends. The giant's story was not one of death, but of waiting. Time, after all, belonged to them before it ever belonged to man. In dreams, the old ones stirred. Their memories played like echoes across the world. The groan of glaciers moving in the north, the rumble of an earthquake beneath the sea, the slow eruption of a volcano, all were fragments of their restless turning beneath the crust. The earth remembered their footsteps because it was shaped by them. Every mountain peak, every valley, every plain bore the imprint of their passing. High above, in the human world, the fires began to die one by one. The night deepened, and the people drifted into sleep. In their dreams they saw tall shadows walking beneath the moon, vast and silent, their eyes glowing faintly like embers in the dark. The children reached out in their sleep as if greeting something familiar. The elders murmured names they did not know they knew. As the wind swept over the mountains and the ocean stilled, the world held its breath. Somewhere beneath the stone, something ancient shifted, listening. Perhaps it was only the earth settling, or perhaps it was a hand brushing against the walls of eternity. The Titans had not vanished. They were waiting, as they always had, patient as the stars. And when the world grows silent again, when fire fades and memory softens, the earth will remember their footsteps, and the giants will rise once more.